And
yeah,
it's not just
yeah,
for let's talk
yeah,
about emotions because emotions are
yeah,
cool or emotions are fun, and they're not. Um, but because those emotions are those emotions are they have a lot of influence, right? Like we talked about fear coming into the boardroom of our mind, right? Whether or not we let that emotion or
yeah,
sadness in, they still have influence, right? And we get exactly impact, and we get really in trouble when we don't listen to those voices, right? And we don't listen to those voices because of all this messaging that we get about emotions, right? And so, and then people wonder, why am I stuck, right? I know that I'm supposed to, get a work towards a promotion or triple my income. But when I try to, rewrite my resume, I just
yeah.
can't do it.
Today, we are talking about transformation, not the overnight glow up kind, but the deep, deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable type. My guest is Misha Wolf, designer, life coach, ex Deloitte facilitator, and creator of Design for Intentional Living. From working with corporate leaders to guiding personal transitions, Misha helps people reimagine the lives they want and then walk toward them with clarity and courage. We'll talk masculinity, loneliness, change, and the slow, brave act of choosing growth. Misha,
Thank you,
welcome to the
Akansha.
show.
Very, very kind
It's a
intro.
pleasure having you.
Really appreciate, yeah, the space for this conversation. Thank you.
I'll ask my first question, which is you have had a fascinating journey from IT design consultant to life coach. What pulled you toward
Thank
this
you.
work?
Yeah, it has been a journey. Um, yeah, so I came into IT work as a kind of a creative design consultant. I come from the arts. And as I started doing that work, it very quickly evolved into almost more like strategic consulting and really providing guidance to executives, decision makers on how to steer tech initiatives. And as I started doing that work, I often saw that decision making would get stuck. And of course, this is why there is, I think, a place for strategists and for kind of people who help to set some kind of a vision or an intention. And that's the work I was doing. But I would notice that decision making would get stuck. And the reason for that I started to see was that often decision makers, executives were not in alignment. And of course, we often talk about alignment in
Yeah,
strategy and in consulting work, right? What do? We provide alignment. And so a lot of that work would be, hey, let's get everyone together in the room and align, right? And so that's one kind of alignment among the folks who are responsible for making some decisions. But I also saw a different kind of misalignment, which is that a lot of the people responsible for leading organizations, leading teams, leading projects were not in alignment within themselves. And this would often kind of be unacknowledged, right? You have people who are responsible for delivering certain business objectives, but in many cases, I saw that the business objectives maybe were not in alignment with their personal values. I often saw that decision makers were a little bit disconnected from some kind of an understanding of personal purpose, from some kind of
yeah,
connection to their own
yeah,
integrity. And, these are very, very big,
yeah,
important, kind of uncomfortable questions, right? And in my
yeah,
role as a business consultant, as a creative guide, right, that it wasn't really my place to address those questions. But I saw that because those questions were not being addressed
yeah,
within the individuals, it was having an impact on making progress, right, within the organizational setting.
yeah,
And so you would see people kind of running into these tensions between business goals, between truly serving their customers, and sometimes business goals aren't always aligned with what the customer base would really find valuable, and in the personal values of the decision makers themselves. And so, I started to recognize this pattern, and it was very sad for me, to be very honest, because you probably know in business settings, personal values, we don't make space for personal values, right? In any real significant way. We kind of push them to the
yeah,
side.
yeah,
And I understand why, personal values are messy. But what would happen is that you would see executive decision makers kind of get paralyzed because they would suspect that something is wrong, but they would struggle to even articulate it, right? Because there's not kind of a conversation to be had around, is what I'm doing for work, aligned with what I think we need to have as a
yeah,
kind of a common good or something like
yeah,
that, right? And so because those folks would struggle to even articulate that, they would often take actions that they would regret. And right. And so that continues to kind of lead
yeah,
to this fear almost, right? Well, I know that I have to make this decision. I don't feel like it's something that I personally feel is the right thing to be doing, but I feel pressure to make this decision. But now I'm afraid of
yeah,
making this decision, right? And so often you would see, and I think some of the listeners probably would recognize, right, this kind of mood within a team or within an organizational structure of kind of fear-based paralysis, right? And all because, I mean, to put it very simply, because the inner work
yeah,
wasn't there. And so I began to notice
yeah,
this pattern.
yeah,
And, me, I'm very motivated by, doing work that matters, right? And really helping, whether it's organizations or people or teams, move not just towards change, but towards change that feels aligned, that feels like it has a place for them, for themselves, and also within the broader society. And I saw that because that inner work wasn't there, that it was hard to support these executives in their decision making. And so if the goal for me, as I saw it, is to, help organizations move towards, a place of some kind of true service to our communities, right? That there needs to be some more foundational work at the individual level of the business decision makers, right?
yeah,
To be in alignment so
yeah,
that then when they're faced with hard decisions, they kind of have a place of integrity that they can reference and say, because I know that this is,
yeah,
what my,
yeah,
let's say, purpose or my, mission in life is, the decision to me is very clear now, right? That work, of course, wasn't being done. I saw that as a gap, and I started to understand that this is probably where I could actually be more effective. Still as a facilitator, right? But now working at the
yeah,
individual level and helping people kind of work through some different kinds of questions, right? Maybe ones that aren't so immediately focused on business goals, but ones that are a little bit more focused on, yeah, what is my personal strategy, right? What are my personal life goals and so on? How do I serve,
yeah,
right, within my life
yeah,
and within business, right?
yeah,
Then you can kind of start to build the rest of the
yeah,
life around a person's sense of integrity, right? But if that core piece isn't there, then life becomes very difficult. And so I thought, this is, I think,
yeah,
for me, the next phase of my own work. I would like to work with people and help them come into personal
yeah,
alignment. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think very interesting point that you mentioned that because where when you used to work for organizations, the decision makers, how how companies' goals were not aligned with their own personal goals, and so you. Being a designer, you have a tendency to basically think more intuitively. You were not being able to explain them things because they were not there, like on a mental level or on an emotional level where they could understand what you were trying to convey. I think that must have been very difficult situation. And yeah, it happens, yeah, quite a lot, especially where people who
Well,
are a bit on a
yeah, thank you.
artistic side
Design,
when it comes
it's
to, yeah,
interesting, right? Because of course design has a kind of creative, intuitive, artistic side. But design is also, in my view, very much a science, right? And so,
yeah,
the personal story I have
yeah,
about myself, which resonates, is, hybrid art and science, right? And so from a kind of professional disciplinary perspective, design is a really kind of nice home for me because it allows for both, right? Yes, there's a kind of creative aspect, but also, design is very based in a kind of scientific method. Let's try something. Let's see if it works. Let's learn something from it and let's iterate. That's science, actually, right? And so design at its core has a kind
Yeah.
of very, I would say, like a creative logic, right? Um, and that's why I think it has found a place in business, right? Because it doesn't just produce an artifact, like you would an art, then, right? Then the executives, like if I just produced a painting, they would be like, well, what do we do with this? It's pretty, right? But so what? Right? Design goes further and it says, well, it's not just pretty. It has, a bearing on how to move the business forward, right? If we do it this way versus this way, you'll have different
Yeah.
outcomes. And
Yeah.
so, but this perspective you just kind of presented, Akansha, is interesting because often design would get kind of misunderstood in business settings precisely along those lines. Oh, these are just pretty pictures, right? Misha, go make it pretty, go make it beautiful. And, again, I think that we have a lot more to offer. And as a designers community, I think we owe it to the organizations that we serve to more accurately convey the value of design beyond just we make things look good, right? And
Yeah.
we make things more palatable to consumers.
Yeah.
No, we have this very unique power to use, creativity, to use art, to connect, but also to provide meaning. This is the thing that I think sometimes executives miss is the capacity for design to make something meaningful. And again, I think we're a little bit afraid of
Yeah.
that kind of meaning making work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
now, in the coaching
Yeah.
work that I'm doing, I've made sure that this is a big part of my practice. Like, so visual thinking, for instance. A lot of us tend to be some of us are very good at it. Some of us struggle. Sometimes when we talk about future visioning, for me, it's actually let's visualize it. Let's put it on a shared screen. Let's do some art therapy kind of work to actually put a vision into the world, right? And that's a very different kind of process, and it has a very different kind of effect and impact on people's view of their own lives once they're able to see it, right? So this
Yeah.
is kind of another aspect of the power of design. Once we see it, it becomes a little bit more real. And once it becomes a little bit more real, then we can say, is this the future that we actually want? Or do we want to visualize and imagine a different future? So art and science, yeah, to your questions.
Got it. So, speaking of design, your brand, Design for Intentional Living, what does that mean to you? And how did it begin? Of course, you already mentioned that, how you were tired of the art, but again,
Yes,
the
thank you.
idea and yeah,
Design
what
for
does that
intentional
mean to
living.
you?
Like as you were reading it, I was like, did I say that somewhere? It must have been in my like LinkedIn profile or something. Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me.
Yeah.
When I heard it, I was like, that sounds cool. Who's doing that? Yeah, I want to work with that person. The brand is Speak Human Studios, and so that's the kind of the brand under which I'm doing this life design work. And yeah, what we promise, what we kind of offer to the people that we work with is designed for intentional living. I think there's two pieces to it, right? One is the intentional living part. So as we were talking a second ago, right? And it's very closely tied with this idea of purpose. We move through life very reactively most often, right? This idea, right? And we don't even really, I
Yes.
think, kind of take stock of it. But for the most part, we move through life as if it's happening to us, right? Right? Something happens.
Yes.
I need money, so I'm going to, look for work because I have this need that I need to react to, right? Or, my parents, my family, my community, they're putting pressure on me to start a family, right? And so now let me go out and meet someone, find someone, start a family, right? And there's nothing wrong with starting a family. There's absolutely nothing wrong with starting a job, right? There's nothing wrong with taking a vacation. Just to recognize that so often we take those actions as a kind of reaction, sometimes like a fix for some kind of a problem that we're seeing, right? I'm burnt out at work, so let me go on vacation, right? Again, a kind of reactive way of taking care of ourselves. As we kind of move this way through life, and there's again kind of at a certain level nothing wrong with it, right? Life brings us challenges, we react to them, right? What happens, what I see, especially as we start to get a little bit older, is that that sequence of decisions that we have made in a reactive way
Yeah.
suddenly adds up to a life that doesn't feel like our own, right?
Yeah.
And in our younger days, maybe the consequences of, moving through life in this way aren't so visible and aren't so binding, right? But what I see, especially as folks get later into their 40s, suddenly they're in lives that not only don't feel like their own, but feel very, very tight, right? Because every decision that has led to that point has been
Yeah.
a reactive one, a defensive one. Oh no, something bad is about to happen to me. Let me just prevent that thing from happening. And now I have a job. It's giving me the money, right? But this is the intentional part. Where
Yeah.
is the intention, right? We are not really connecting to our intention, right? We're not connecting to, again, these very kind of soft ideas about purpose, right? Role in life, mission. I'll say it this way, what am I here for? But also, what am I really kind of suited for? What is the thing that is most fulfilling for me, right? To do with my time, with my energy, with my life. We don't ask ourselves those questions. And when we make decisions without asking ourselves those questions, we often get into situations that don't feel good, right? And so the offer in my work, in my coaching work, is to recover some of that intention, right? Well, what do I actually want?
Attention.
What does actually feel good, right? We're very scared in general of
Yeah.
those kinds of questions. We're not supposed to ask those questions. When we do ask those questions, we often get reprimanded, right? You're being vain. You're just thinking about
Yeah.
yourself. You have to think about your community. You have to think about everybody else but yourself. Yeah, be selfless, right?
What do you?
And,
Yeah.
I think that that advice is often doesn't serve us very well, especially if it's not in balance. Well, when do I get to think about myself? And so that's the intentional part, right? It so happens that the professional discipline that I come from, design, is very focused on intention, right? As designers, the first thing we ask when we engage with a client with a project is, well, what is the goal? What is the intended outcome here? Because as designers, we know that any particular product or experience can be like this, or it can be like this, or it can be like this, right? And the direction in which we go really depends on
Yeah.
where we want to end up, right? And so from a kind of business strategic
Definitely.
design perspective, that way of thinking makes perfect sense to us, right? What is the desired outcome? When we come back to our own
Yeah.
lives,
Yeah.
we don't ask that question. When we ask that question, we get very scared and uncomfortable, right? And so that is the offering. Hey, if you're in a place in your life, and sometimes people come to me exactly in this situation. Hey, Misha, I've done all the things the way that I was told I was supposed to do them. I got all the right jobs. I did all the
Yeah.
family things that I was supposed to do. Why am I not happy? Why do I feel like I
Yeah.
hate waking up for work? Why am I terrified on Sundays? Right? These are very, very serious questions, right? I've had some people tell me I feel like I am in a cage in my own life. This is the life I thought I was supposed to have, right? And so then, when we start to work together, part of the first thing we do is we just start to create a safe space to start asking those kinds of questions, right? Yeah. A lot of my kind of work with
Uncomfortable
folks at that
questions.
point in the process is usually just kind of giving people permission to ask, well, what am I? What should I be doing? What kind of life do I even want? Right? And so that's when the work begins. But this is the kind of the design. And then design is, well, once we have an outcome, we can actually, yeah, produce some prototypes, let's say, right, for you to try. Well, I think I want to be, I had a client recently tell me that she's had this fantasy sometimes of a career as a flight attendant, right? It's not what she does now. And she
Yeah.
even shared that,
Yeah. Yeah.
when she's shared that fantasy with people in her life, family, parents, they would often tell her why, that work is very hard. It's not very glamorous. Everyone has an opinion about her fantasy, right? And so part of the work is, first
Yeah.
of all, let's give this fantasy its proper place, right? You deserve to certainly consider what that might look like. And it sounds like there's something that is motivating, right? Something that is exciting, something that feels fulfilling about that work, right? And then the design start part starts, right? Well, how can we try this out, right? You have your own ongoing life, and so obviously we can't just say everything's over now, you're a flight attendant, right? We have to approach things in a kind of incremental, iterative, right? This is the science part of design. Can we find some ways for you to audition this projected outcome, right? And so we design kind of little experiments and we start to kind of build a more holistic picture of that life that includes this piece. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds beautiful because many people, they do not live their life as they want to. And as you rightly said, I would say perfectly put, that as humans, most of us are in this constant reactive mode. We are just, so I think, yeah, that's a beautiful thing that you do. So, my next question is, as a coach, what is the biggest misconception people
I
have
like this
about
question.
coaching?
I think the biggest
Yeah.
misconception, and it's interesting to me because I come from corporate consulting, right? And I think sometimes people think coaches are more like consultants, right? Which is that as a consultant, your job is to basically tell the organization which direction they should go in, what actions they should take, right? Sometimes when people engage me as a coach, what they're looking for is that, Misha, tell me what to do with my life, right? And of course, um, I can have an opinion, I can have a perspective, right? But none of that really matters because at the end of the day, um, I can't take the actions for that person, right? I can tell them, listen, I think that you should, I mean, I would never tell anyone this, right? You should leave your family, you should leave your wife, right? So that's, you know, like an example of what not to do, right? But even if that was very clear to me that this is what the person should do, me saying that,
Yeah.
doesn't really serve the person because what my job as a coach is to get them to a place of taking ownership. You know what I mean? And so whatever the decision is, right? Part of like what you recognized earlier that we don't show up for our lives intentionally. Sometimes what that looks like is that we don't take ownership, right? Because I had made all the decisions leading up to this point reactively, what happens when we live in this kind of reactionary way is that because we're kind of reacting to things that are happening to us, we tend to not take ownership of our actions, right? I did this. Why? Not because I know that it's the right thing to do or it's the thing that I know I'm supposed to be doing. I did this because I didn't have another choice, right? And,
Yeah.
we see this, right? And what happens when we are moving through life without taking ownership of the choices that we make is that the outcomes that we get from those choices, we also feel like don't belong to us, right? Well, it's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had to do that, and so because of what I did, because I had to do it, and then, now I'm in a relationship with children that I don't really care about, right? I didn't really want to get married in the first place, right? Well, so people come to me and they go, "Oh, you're a coach. Tell me what I should do. I'm in a really hard place." Right?
Yeah.
You know, part of the work that needs to happen is there needs to be some taking ownership of those choices, right? Because again, for me to tell the person, if you don't want to continue to show up for your family, you should tell them that, right? That will just perpetuate this
Yeah.
pattern of not taking
Yeah.
ownership, right? And so while me telling them what to do might give them some kind of like a pathway out of a difficult situation, right?
Yeah.
What it won't do is get
Yeah.
them to a place of some kind of peace and some kind of integrity, right? Because they will make that choice because someone else told them to do that. And they will continue to make choices based on what someone else thinks they should do, right? And so again, if they're looking for that kind of guidance, they could very easily go to their friends, right? Friends love giving you advice about what to do, right?
Yeah.
With that, exactly,
Without any
exactly, exactly,
expertise.
right? So this, I think, is important for people to understand. And when people come to me, hey, Misha, I'm struggling to make a change. I'm struggling to move into a new phase of my life, right? It's one of the first conversations we have is this is what I love doing. I love people supporting through this process, but here's how I do it, right? How I do it is I help you identify and take ownership of the choices that you are going to make, right? And so the work is really about showing people kind of a way towards commitments, towards commitments, right? To
Yeah.
themselves and to others. And so to your question, like I would say that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that I see, especially people who are coming from business, where they're used to hiring consultants who tell them
Yeah.
exactly what they should do, right?
Yeah.
This work is about self-ownership, right? And so, yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yes,
Self ownership
absolutely. Yes.
is the key word. Got it. So, in your work, how do you distinguish between transformation and just coping?
What a beautiful question, Akansha. Thank you. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a little bit of what we were just talking about, right? Coping is it's a fix, right? And there's nothing wrong with a fix. And there is a lot of situations where we need coping, right? I mean, another word for coping, sometimes coping has a little bit of a neutral or even like a negative connotation, right?
Negative connotation.
Let's make it a little bit maybe more affirming, right? Coping can also be about relief, right? Yeah, if I'm in
Relief.
pain, right? Whether it's physical or psychological or spiritual, right? I feel like I'm in the wrong place, in the wrong life, in the wrong, just, yeah, in a wrong identity. Sometimes we need to cope, right? And we need to relieve ourselves of the pain, right? And,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you have a headache from a hangover, right? Um, and you
Yeah.
take some aspirin, right? Please, right? Like you have a headache, you should relieve, right? So that's
Yeah.
coping, right? Yeah.
That's
If you're
coping.
laying there in agony, in pain, going, I'm never going to drink again, right? And then you take the painkiller, and then that same night you go out again, right? Well, so, okay, you did the
Yeah.
coping, but you didn't do the thing that you said you were going to do, which is change your life in some way, right? To prevent yourself from now experiencing this pain, right? And so that would be a kind of an
Yeah.
example of the difference, right? Between, well,
Yeah.
I don't like feeling this pain. So there's two ways that I can not have the pain, right? I can take a painkiller
Yeah.
after the fact, or I can start to
Yeah.
understand the patterns in my life that lead me to the pain in the first place, right? And then
Yeah.
I can ask
Where,
myself some of these questions that we're talking about, right? And hopefully get to a place where I can make some commitments to myself, right? And so then that becomes transformation, is when we actually are able to make those kinds of more foundational changes, right? Coping comes after the fact. And again, sometimes we need that. We
yeah.
cannot, and the other thing I'll say, the kind of the relationship between coping and transformation is that transformation is very difficult work right? To change our lives is very hard. The example we just used around alcohol and drinking, right? Notoriously difficult for people to make those
Yeah.
kinds of changes. Our relationship patterns are very difficult
Yeah.
to change.
Yeah.
our professional lives sometimes are very, very hard to change. What makes it harder is
Change.
when there's pain, right? Pain is a really great motivator, but more often than not, it motivates us towards
Yeah.
coping, towards relieving the pain, right? It's harder for us to
Yeah.
move to actually changing those patterns. The challenge is that
Yeah.
we need to be in a place where we're not feeling the pain for us to take up the work of
Yeah.
change seriously, right? And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, there's
Yeah.
an old kind of Buddhist parable, right? Kind of around this topic. You know, a warrior gets struck by an arrow, right? And healer comes over, right? And everybody kind of understands what the healer should do as the first thing, right? They should remove the arrowhead. They should
Yeah.
relieve the pain, right? What they should not
Yeah.
do is come over to
Yeah.
the warrior and say, you know, you really shouldn't go to war in the first place.
Yeah.
Exactly. That message will not make any sense because the person is in pain. And so, as healers, as change makers, change guides, right? I think we have to be very attentive to where in that healing cycle are the people who are coming to us. And so, we talked about self-ownership.
Yeah.
And so for me, self-ownership is a kind of a point on the path of personal growth. And I identify kind of three
Yeah.
points on that path. And self-ownership in that framework, right? This is the designer part. Frameworks. Designers love frameworks. Self-ownership is a really nice place to be in. When you take ownership of your decisions, when you take ownership of who you are, right? That's a really beautiful place from which to take action and to develop relationships. Sometimes people come to me in a very different place. They come to me in a place that I call servitude. Okay? Servitude is a very different way of just being in the world. Servitude is when we feel like we are always showing up for others, right? Right? Where we are not making decisions based on what we know is right for ourselves, right? We are making decisions based on what others
Yeah.
think we should be doing, right? And I want to be clear that sometimes
Yeah.
we're in situations that are very, very difficult situations where, it doesn't matter what our mindset is, but we have to, leave our home because it's not
Yeah.
safe, right? I think that we can be in those kinds of situations and still be in places of self-ownership, right? Because we know that we are being violated and we need to move forward, right? Servitude is the opposite. Servitude is when we say, when you see people who have, it seems, every material privilege, right? I have money, I have all the things. Why do I
Yeah.
still hate my life? Right? Oh, because this job, even though it pays me $1 million a year, is actually like not what I want to be doing, right? That person is still in servitude. And so sometimes people
Yeah.
come to me in that place of everyone's against me,
Yeah.
right? And so before we start to talk about what does some kind of future visioning work look like, how do we get you to be the person that you're meant to be? The first piece is we kind of have to pull out that arrow of servitude, right? Just
Yeah.
get a person to a place of, no, I'm okay, right? I have all the things. I can take hold of myself, right? That's pulling out the arrow. Once we're there, then we can start to talk about from this place of self-ownership, how do we get you to that third place of personal growth, which is service,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
and then that becomes how do we envision, how do we design this intentional life, right? Because the thing that feels most,
Life.
I see the thing that feels most fulfilling for people is showing up for others, right? But it's very hard for us to show up for others when we're not first able to show up for ourselves, right? And it's very hard for us to show up for ourselves if we
Yeah.
feel like everybody's against us, right? And so that's kind of the
Against us. Yeah.
transformation framework, right? And what happens for
Yeah.
people in servitude is that, back to your original question, is that we have to make space for coping. We have to make space for relief, right? I worked all day, all week for a company that I hate. What do I need right now? I can't possibly think about what a, life of intention looks like. I just need a weekend of Netflix. Have the weekend of Netflix, right? come back
Yeah.
to some kind of a place of just rest, right? We need to have a lot of room for rest in this work, right? Before we get to ambition and growth and so on. So that's the kind of the basic flow, I would say, right? But yeah, the clients that are most attracted to me, I would say, sometimes like in the coaching space, people provide a lot of different kinds of services. Some of that work is sometimes is marketed as wellness coaching, right? Um, that's not quite
Yeah.
my space, but wellness coaching is very much about developing healthy healing habits, right? Maybe instead of a weekend of Netflix, what does
Yeah.
having some exercise look like, right? Exercise is a kind of coping
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
right? It gets the blood moving, gets us out of our head into our body, but it's also active, right? You're showing up for it. So anyway,
Yeah.
coping can look like a lot of different
Yeah.
things for growth and for transformation, right? Some of those self-care routines kind of need to be already in place. And if they're not, then of course I work with folks to build those. Because starting to let's talk about growth and because growth is requires a lot of energy. Okay, you're not in that place, right? Let's develop some basic like maintenance things, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.